Hello, my name is Dr. Linda Rosa Lugo, and I am an associate professor at the University of Central Florida in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Today we are speaking from the Morgridge International Reading Center here at the University of Central Florida, and I am here with Dr. Julia Esparza Brown, a third-generation Chicana. She is an assistant professor in special education at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. She received her doctorate from Portland State University, her master's in special education at the University of San Diego, and her bachelor's of music. She received her school psychology training at San Diego State University and has almost 20 years of experience in public schools as a bilingual and special education teacher. While in the public school setting, she created a bilingual special ed classroom. At Portland State, Julie's teaching, research, and publications focus on the interface of bilingual and special education. Additionally, she consults nationally on issues related to response to intervention and English learners, least biased assessment of English learner students, and effective instruction for diverse learners. Welcome to our campus, Julie.
Thanks for having me here. Well, as the topic today is response to intervention, known as RTI with English learners. And there are a few questions that are going to help guide the conversation today. So the questions that I'll address are, what is RTI? We'll define that. And what does the RTI process look like for English learners? So what are the connects and the disconnects between a typical RTI process? And how do cultural, linguistic, and experiential differences of children impact this process? Also, how does RTI help to distinguish children who are struggling in their academics because of language differences versus language disorder? And is comprehensive special evaluation still a necessary piece of this model? And what competencies do education professionals need in order to use the RTI process with English learners? So those are the basic questions that we will address today. First, we're going to start with defining response to intervention. So my definition comes from the National Center on Response to Intervention, and they define it as rigorous implementation of RTI includes a combination of high-quality, culturally and linguistically responsive instruction, assessment, and evidence-based intervention. Comprehensive RTI implementation will contribute to more meaningful identification of learning and behavioral problems, improve instructional quality, provide all students with the best opportunities to succeed in school, and assist with the identification of learning disabilities and other disabilities. The major point of RTI, though, is to improve learning outcomes for all children. So one major goal of RTI is to look at the learning outcomes for all children as we reduce the number of inappropriate referrals and placements in special education of EL and other minority children. And we do this by intervening early in their educational process. RTI is conceptualized as a tiered model of support, and the most common models currently are in reading. What is on the screen is the typical triangle that shows the tiers of interventions in the RTI model. However, my triangle here has been adjusted for EL students. So let's look at what this process looks like for English learners. At the bottom, the green base of the triangle refers to general education. And we say typically that 80% of children should be successful in a general education classroom. However, this is all predicated upon effective instruction for all students. For English learners, we still may not be there where we are adjusting instruction to meet their cultural and their linguistic needs. So what we have to be aware of here is that core instruction has to be adjusted for their experiential, cultural, and linguistic differences, and that when we look at the 80% of students that should be successful in Gen Ed, we really need to disaggregate those subgroups to make sure that the 20% of students that are struggling aren't all minority kids or English learners, and that we're really, again, looking by groups. And another core piece to consider in this model is that I often hear people misidentifying ESL services as an intervention. But for English learners, ESL services are part of their core curriculum, and it is not an intervention.
I think that's such an excellent point, because I have heard that said often enough, that they look at ESL as being one of those interventions.
So
That's
I
a
want to
great
dispel
point.
that myth now. As we move up the tiers and we go to the middle tier or tier 2, this instruction then is still based on core concepts and goals, but we consider it a double dose. So this might be held in a pull-out type of program where the students are getting a double dose of the curriculum, so they're not pulled out during their classroom literacy experiences. And what's important for English learners here is that in addition to that intervention at Tier 2, we're considering EL students' oracy needs, meaning listening and speaking needs. So the interventions that we provide need to be adjusted for their language differences by previewing vocabulary and looking at the language structures, just as core needs to be modified to meet their language needs. And at this level, we say that 15% of the students should be successful. Now, for the final 5% of students that will not be successful in Tier 2, we move them up to Tier 3. Tier 3 then is the most intensive level of instructional support, and the same holds true throughout all of the tiers. For English learners, we still have to consider that instruction and intervention needs to include an oracy component for them. Now, this may or may not include a special education evaluation in Tier 3, and we'll discuss that later. The other thing that makes this triangle different is that you'll see around the triangle there is some text, and what this is indicating is it's showing our model. My colleague, Dr. Amanda Sanford, and I, and a former student of ours, Ms. Miranda Turner, are developing a model that we call PLUS, and that is to look at research-based instruction for English learners and how we can use that research to enhance instruction and particularly interventions in this RTI model, and we'll talk about that later as well.
Can I just ask you something, Julie? Because I noticed that when you talked about the different tiers, one of the words that you used was they move into the tiers. What does that necessarily mean?
That means that we'll look to, we need to gauge students' progress on the interventions that we have in place, and we'll talk about how we do those upcoming here. Great. So I'm going to identify next the key features of an RTI model. And there are 4 key features that I'll discuss here. Evidence-based core curriculum. So the goal is for all students to reach grade level benchmarks. But this model assumes effective instruction in the core for all students. And for English learners, I'm not sure that that really happens. So that's a concept to keep in mind. Number 2, universal screening in foundational components of reading or math to determine who is at risk for reading difficulties. The third component is that we intervene early in the reading or math process with increasingly intense evidence-based interventions that are taught with fidelity. And the last feature, use screening and progress monitoring data to determine students' response to intervention and their progress towards grade level benchmarks and standards. Now, we're going to look at these more closely because each of those features is problematic when we're working with English learners, and I'll tell you why. So the first one, evidence-based core instruction. Well, there's a limited amount of core curriculum that adjusts the instruction for English learners' specific language needs and even experiential needs. And educators often lack the basic competencies in working with English learners. Therefore, that really needs to be addressed in pre-service programs. The key feature of universal screening for all students, the problem there may be that we need to consider the reliability and validity of all of the assessment tools that we're learning. Therefore, that is an extra lens that we need to look through when we determine which tools we're going to use for screening and progress monitoring.
Can I just ask you, in a couple of explanations, it seems to be a lot of vocabulary that maybe we are not as familiar with, and one is fidelity. The other one is when you talk about early intervening services. I know that sometimes that is a little bit confused with early intervention services, and I just think that it would be good if you can expand on those a little bit.
Okay. I'm first going to touch on the early intervening services, and that's why I discuss it as early intervening services as opposed to early intervention, meaning that through the universal screening for all students, we're identifying right away, because the screening starts in kindergarten, those students who are maybe at risk for reading failure. The word fidelity in this model addresses the need to instruct as the curriculum is written. So we're looking to ensure that children aren't struggling because of lack of appropriate access to the curriculum, and that the teachers the teachers are teaching it as written, so that teacher A is going to teach the core curriculum the same as teacher B next door. So that's what we're discussing with fidelity. So going back to two more key features, intervening early that we just talked about in reading, with increasingly intense researched or evidence-based intervention is a key component of this model. But there are limited intervention programs that have been researched on English learners. And as a matter of fact, if we go to the What Works Clearinghouse, which is the government site that evaluates the quality of the research base on intervention programs, we'll find that there's perhaps only 14 programs on that site that have included English learners. So again, realizing that there is very little to choose from is an issue. And then finally, the use of screening and progress monitoring data to determine students' responsiveness or their rate of progress towards meeting those grade level benchmarks. Again, the assessment tools may or may not be reliable and valid for use with English learners, and the issue of how do we set appropriate goals for English learners, and that we need to understand from the onset that English learners cannot be expected to make the same growth towards meeting those grade level benchmarks as English-only students, because they begin at a lower level in general, and they're needing to learn in a language they're still learning, so their rate of progress may look different, and we need to consider that aspect.
And I think another important point that you mentioned was the issue of teachers having, not that much training in the implementation of some of these evidence-based interventions that you're speaking about.
So hopefully videos like this will help to provide more training for all.